Welcome to my class. In this particular video session, we will talk about the distinction between grid computing and cloud computing. Regarding the meaning of grid computing and cloud computing, there are separate videos. But in this particular video, our focus will be on distinction between grid computing and cloud computing. First one, on the basis of management. Decentralized management works in grid computing. There is centralized management in cloud computing. Second, dependent. The user organization is dependent upon the individual resource provider's computing capability. The user organization is dependent upon the cloud service provider's computing capability. Third point, orientation. Grid computing, it is an application oriented. Cloud computing, it is service oriented. Fourth point, resource management. In grid computing, the resources are distributed, that is decentralized, among different computing units to process a single big task. In cloud computing, the computing resources are managed centrally and they are placed over multiple servers in cluster. Fifth, owned and managed. Grids are owned and managed by some organization handling complex problems. Cloud servers are owned and managed by infrastructure providers. Location of resources. In grid computing, resource providers may be located at distant places. In case of cloud computing, cloud servers are placed at physically separate places. Seventh point, objective. Grid computing is a collaborative sharing of resources, whereas cloud computing is essentially a use of service. Eighth point, task versus services. In grid computing, it is a collection of interconnected computers that can be called for large-scale voluntary processing tasks. In case of cloud computing, it is a collection of interconnected servers that can be used to provide variety of services. On the basis of accessible. It is accessible through grid middleware, that is controller. Cloud computing is accessible through standard web protocols. The 10th point is architecture. Grid computing is based on distributed computer architecture. Cloud computing is based on client-server computer architecture. 11th point, computational requirement. In case of grid computing, the computational requirements are quite high in scale. And in case of cloud computing, the computational requirements are based on client's demand. 12th point, application type. In grid computing, in general, it is batch processing. In cloud computing, it is interactive processing. 13th point, on the basis of entities. Grid computing, there are three entities involved in grid computing. First one is user organization, second is controller, and the third is resource providers. In case of cloud computing, there are two entities involved. The first one is cloud infrastructure providers, that is servers, and the second is client seeking services. 14th, level of abstraction. In grid computing, the level of abstraction is quite low as more details are visible. In case of cloud computing, the level of abstraction is quite high as more details are not visible. Fifteenth point, transparency. There is low transparency in operation in case of grid operations. There is high transparency in operations in case of cloud computing. Time to run the operations. Grid computing in general does not require real-time operations, whereas cloud computing involves real-time services. 17th point, operating system used. Grid makes use of any standard operating system. In cloud computing, a hypervisor VM on which multiple operating systems run is used. 18th point, ownership. In grid computing, there are multiple owner of resources. In case of cloud computing, the single cloud service provider owns the ownership of all resources. Nineteenth point, interconnection. In grid computing, it is mostly connected through internet with latency and low bandwidth. In cloud computing, it is mostly connected through internet. There are dedicated high-end servers with low latency and high bandwidth. 20th, security. In grid computing, there are less security issues. And in case of cloud computing, there are more security issues in cloud computing as all data resides on service providers' servers. 21st point, scalability requirements. The scalability requirements are lower on part of resource providers, whereas in case of cloud computing, the scalability requirements are higher on part of the cloud service providers. Thank you very much.